First Man on the Moon. I went to see this movie with my dad and half-siblings. We had spent quite a while before trying to decide what to go see, and our possibilities ultimately came down to either Halloween, not the Goosebumps one, the other one, Hunter Killer, which is more my brother's kind of movie than mine, though I'd been fine with it. My younger brother and I, in our tastes in movies and video games, not that I have time to play video games anymore, is analogous to the difference between Konata and Kagami from Lucky Star, in that I, like Konata, prefer fantasies with complex storylines and Dungeons & Dragons like role-playing games. My brother is much more like Kagami about first-person shooter and combat games. Eventually, we all decided to see First Man, which is about the story behind Neil Armstrong, the commander of the Apollo 11 mission, which traveled to the moon. The film does not really focus on any of the other astronauts. You learn a little bit about them. Buzz Aldrin is there, but barely important in the film, story-wise. The movie opens up with Neil holding a baby girl who did in fact exist. Neil Armstrong did have a daughter named Karen who died of cancer at age 2, which is extremely sad. Of course, we who are alive today, and even more so those of us born in the last couple decades, find it difficult to really comprehend just how much child mortality was a common and ever-present reality of many decades ago, and the further back in time you go, the more so. Venezuela, unfortunately, is learning that lesson again at a terrible price after having voted in a socialist. Brazil as well, although Brazil, people just recently voted in Jair Bolsonaro, who hopefully will do a better job. He's a little more conservative. Countries that turn socialist learn the realities of how easily common infant and mortality, how easily common infant and child mortality can return very quickly. Polio has even returned to Venezuela. In the middle decades of the 20th century, Russia was known as the Soviet Union, or the USSR, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which was communist until the 1990s. I think it fell apart in 1991. And now, almost 80 years of horrible living conditions have motivated the Russians to now return to their Orthodox Christianity roots and withdraw from the wide-scale globalist project going on these days, which they had every right to do. I just went and double-checked some of my notes. Okay, the USSR, also called the Soviet Union, collapsed in 1991. It had been a society where the government controlled everything, and any opponents or critics of the government were disappeared. Translate, Great Purge. And that is exactly what the leftists, the Democrats, are seeking to do in America now, and we have to stop them. In the second half of the 20th century, this USSR and the United States of America were in a technological arms race. Usually in movies that take place, and history books as well, take place at that time, called it the Cold War. And for a long time, there were a number of proxy wars fought on the battlegrounds of other countries, such as Korea, which had been split into communist North Korea and free market South Korea, the consequences of which remain to this day. One of the aspects of this race was the space race. The Soviet Union and America were in a contest to launch the first satellites into space, and after the Soviet Union launched Sputnik in 1957, that was what really set the space race into motion. To get to space, it had been about weapons and other technology before then. Now it was about space. If you've ever read the book or seen the movie October Sky, it takes place right at this time, right after the launching of Sputnik, after the Russians had revealed that they'd sent the satellite into orbit. Now, in this film, First Man, that is, there is a scene in which the NASA engineers draw a scale distance diagram of the Earth and the Moon. And at the Natural History Museum, where I volunteer, there's actually, in the planetarium, there is a basketball and a baseball representing the Earth and Moon. It's a cool little model. And you have little dots on the floor. Each would be the proportional to the size of a basketball representing Earth. The circumference of the Earth, and about 10 of those in a line make the distance from the Earth to the Moon. They are pretty far apart, although compared to other celestial bodies, that's pretty much, that's almost touching the Earth in terms of distance in space, but it's interesting. I wish they had actually painted them like the Earth and the Moon. That'd be fun to see, but they just have them as basketball and baseball. But, well, what is cool about that is you can recreate the model at home if you have a basketball and a baseball to work. Measure the circumference of the basketball, move the baseball 10 of those circumference distances away, and you have a scale model of the Earth and the Moon. Anyway, all of these events and choices throughout history, the free market, countries turning socialist because that they think that'll fix everything, and the truth is it destroys everything. And the people from socialist or communist countries like to flee to capitalist countries, but then they vote for socialism all over again. And this is why it needs to be stopped. And the contest, the confrontation, the race in power and in technology between, at that time, the free world, which was the United States, which was the most powerful country at the time, by quite a greater extent than it is now, and the USSR, which was communist. There was a race to see, of course, well, I keep kind of telling the same story. But the NASA engineers and astronauts said, okay, we're not going to put another satellite in space, we're going to go all the way to the moon. And that's where you get that it's really cool to do that scale model experiment. All of these turn of events and choices throughout history are important to know and understand. And if you hated history in school, well, that's probably because your teacher didn't do a very good job of teaching history, which is very common, of course. Really, none of mine did very well either. But you could make it interesting, and I think the way you would make it interesting is by showing the movies relevant to the times you're talking about, and having these conversations about what do the events mean, what led to those events, to those choices, what came after, what are the consequences today. All very interesting to talk about. And in our time now, the globalists and socialists all over the world are trying to tear down strong and stable countries by suppressing the rights of men, particularly fathers. Take fathers away from the families, and then appeal to the emotions and fears of single mothers and claimed minorities, although whites are no longer the minority most people say they are, at least not in numbers, to rely on the government for sustenance. And that's how you get totalitarian governments voted in rather than have to spend any efforts conquering. conquer through appeasement, I guess. Good fathers, like Neil Armstrong was clearly, as you can see in this movie, which, if you read up on him, this film is very consistent. I'd say one of the most accurate to a historical person's life that I've ever seen, once I read a bit about Neil Armstrong and how his life really played out. He breaks down in tears multiple times upon his daughter's death, and when memories of her surface. Good fathers are the protectors for women and children in society, and that women have turned against this is causing us a lot of trouble all over the world. If you take the fathers away, society's safety collapses. Government will promise safety at the expense of freedoms to their people, but you know, or should know, how reliable politicians' promises are. At least I hope you are. Neil Armstrong. Very interesting life story. And I don't want to get into his entire story here. That'd take another hour to talk about, but he had been a naval ensign and aviator and flew in the Korean War, which had been a war in the early 1950s between North Korea, which had had the support of China and the Soviet Union, and South Korea, with the principal support of the United States. Neil Armstrong was selected for the first man in space Soonest program in 1958, and there had been an accident, and you see it shown in this movie, in which 3 of his friends died not long before he and Buzz Aldrin were about to go into space. And you'd think that would cancel the space program, but the space hype was very high at the time, not only in the program of space exploration itself, but among the general population as well. So both in the government and in NASA and in the general population. This is before the American government swelled to the size it is now. So it was a little bit more focused on getting things done than on just getting votes. When the government starts to focus purely on getting votes, you've got real trouble. And of course, with the Soviet Union and the United States, there was an arms race going on that we called the Cold War. It was a bunch of proxy wars. It was... I was born after the decades of the seconds away from nuclear war scare. I was... I think, when did that end in the early 80s or the late 80s? I was either not born yet or I would have been very, very young. Toddler, if that. Anyway. Today, Russia and the United States are not at odds, though that was nearly ruined in 2016 by Hillary Clinton. Thank God America woke up and elected Donald Trump instead. And Trump has been doing rather well as president. The American people do not want another war with Russia. And the Russian people do not want war with America. And I hope there will never be another. And, American voters tried really hard and won by... you remember the night in 2016, the November election, everyone was on the edge of their seats. I remember very clearly, a couple days after, messages, YouTube comments, emails around the world. Multiple people were talking about who were thanking America for not electing someone who was gung-ho for going to war with Russia. Really dodged a nuclear bullet there. Now, there was one part of this movie that got me scratching my head. So when Neil is about to leave for the Apollo 11 mission, this is near the end of the movie, he spends the night packing and won't even speak to his sons about it, about his... Well, his sons know what he's doing, but he won't say goodbye. He won't sit them down and talk to them until his wife puts her foot down and told him he needed to say goodbye to them. And because very likely it could have been goodbye. I was asking my dad later that night. We all went for Chinese food after this movie, and he and I and my siblings were sitting down, and I was asking him, what do you think Neil's mindset was at the time, that he was just focused on packing and not really talking to his family at this time, and was about the most closed off he'd been really throughout the movie. And my dad said, well, he probably wasn't focusing at that time on the fact that he might not come back. He knew it, but he wasn't focusing on it. He was focusing on the mission, on what his life had become about, what he did for a living to support his family, and on the task ahead. I can understand that. It's similar to the saying about being in the army or going to war. Undertake the mission prepared to die, and you will survive. Go afraid to die, and you won't come back. And I'm not sure what the first variation I heard of that saying was. I know I've heard several throughout the years. And I think what it's saying is, if you accept the hardship and uncertainty, you have a much greater chance of getting through the challenge, keeping a cool head, and one day returning to your life and family. Now, we know it doesn't always work out that way, but the lesson is an important one about life nonetheless. And Neil Armstrong was selected as commander of the mission because he had proven himself not only the most familiar with the technology they were traveling in, but his ability to remain calm, cool, and collected even in the face of possible certain death. And this is established earlier on in the movie. This is what we see during his test flights. And satellite model. Does he actually come up in a satellite first? I think he did. It is also worthwhile to go and watch the movie Apollo 13 after watching this movie. That is another mission that was going to travel to the surface of the moon, but there was a problem with the rocket. There had been some malfunction or some accident in taking off, and they were leaking fuel, and NASA and the astronauts traveling in the rocket were trying every scenario, every plan in the book just to get them home. It's a great movie. It's a great message about failure is not an option, about not giving up. And that really happens. And after that, NASA pretty much decided that returning to the moon was not worth the continued costs and risks, though there has been interest in doing so from time to time, especially in the possible conversion of the moon into a mining and launching base for further space exploration missions. It's a long way away now, but it's possible one day. Nowadays, people are looking forward to missions to Mars, and my overall perspective about that is we are not ready. Culturally speaking, all over the world, we are not yet ready to take on the challenge of expanding humans among the planets and stars. Probes and robots are one thing. Exploration rovers and robots, and that's all fine. We've done that numerous times. We've sent those to moons, to comets, to there's a flyby Pluto, the New Horizons mission in 2015, and that came back with some pretty cool pictures. But human settlements are another thing entirely, and we are not yet ready. First, before we attempt any efforts to send humans to Mars or terraform other planets or any of that, first, we have to defeat the three great evils threatening our world today: socialism, feminism, and Islam. Once those three evils have been defeated, and once human beings all over the world commit to treating their children far better, I say this because it's a key factor in raising healthy adults. You first have to treat the children with more kindness and compassion than we've been doing, and not separating good fathers from their families anymore. After all that is accomplished, then we can talk about spreading out among the planets and stars. I highly recommend seeing this film. The one thing I felt was missing was that they didn't show the planting of the American flag on the moon. You'll see the flag briefly as the astronauts are leaving the surface of the moon, but you don't see the planting, and seeing as the landing on the moon was an American achievement, it really should have been. The story of the moon landing is the story of heroes, and it is a story worth watching movies about and learning about and celebrating.